Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this week's mini-series on NXIVM. If you would like to support the show from as little as £1 a month to gain early access to ad-free full-length episodes, you can find me at patreon.com/the Cult Vault. But for now, here is Susan. You talked about your lead up to your first ESP experience and how you were somebody with a psychology master's or a master's in psychology, and somebody that was counseling and helping people heal emotional wounds, and also to help people uh, with their help them with their business skills as well. So did you feel like you had found that gap that you were looking for when you originally went over to ESP in the first place? You said there was a gap missing in your work. Did you feel like this was going to fill that void?
Well, at first I really liked it, but I didn't think it would. When I first went in, I didn't think it would take over my time at my clinic. But at some point, it got to the point where I had to make a choice between what I was doing because it became time consuming to where I eventually had to walk away from my clinic, you know. And I still did massage on the side. But then it just got, when I eventually opened up my center, I just didn't have time I turned over my practice to a couple other people that were in my clinic. And then we opened up the training facility. And then it just, um, I kind of walked away from what I had originally built, which, was regretful at that point, when I look back on it. But, you can't go back and go like, oh my gosh, I should have stayed with that because, it's kind of I don't know if you ever saw the movie Sliding Doors. You can't go back and go like, oh, I went through that door, and if I would have gone through that door, my life would have been totally different, because there is no going back. But eventually, um, NXIVM took over what I had originally done. So it wasn't like I could intermix the two
Right.
things. So it just became time consuming. And there was a point in my life where I thought that I would do ESP for the rest of my life, until I found out I started to get red flags, and I started to do some research. I did the ultimate betrayal to ESP as I went to the Rick Ross website, you know, and I started doing some research, and I was appalled. And then I went to Nancy and I told her, I said, gosh, I went to the Rick Ross website, and I have some questions for you. And oh my God, if her head could have spun around and puked green shit all over me, that would have happened, because that was like the ultimate betrayal, that any member of NXIVM could have ever done, is gone to Rick Ross, because he was like the ultimate enemy. They were in a lawsuit with him and stuff. And she said, you have changed your internal representation of Vanguard forever. It's kind of like, and I said, well, I just, there's things happening that I don't understand why you guys do it. And I've asked so many questions, but you just deflect them. I said, you're like Wonder Woman, and I ask a question and you just go, pa-ching, 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 pa-ching. And I said, and you won't be honest with me. I said, you borrow money you can't repay, and you're in these lawsuits that I don't understand why you're suing people. You just make it worse for the company, and you treat people like shit, and you don't pay people properly, and like, people come in happily married and then they end up getting divorced, and I just don't understand why you're doing this. You don't have to do it, and like, so, and I said, I'm starting to have red flags. And that was the day I started nailing my coffin and NXIVM shut, and they just started treating me poorly after that. But, and I don't know if you read any of Yanya Lollige's books, but she talks about how, when you're in a cult, you have this shelf behind you and you start to put your red flags on it, and then at some point it collapses. And at that point, my shelf hadn't collapsed, but I started asking, my shelf was getting full. And then one time I went back to Albany, and I got summons to Nancy's house. I got summons to Nancy's house a lot. Well, one, I was a massage therapist and she always wanted me to give her a massage, and she was supposed to pay me for them, but I never got paid. So, it's kind of like, oh, yeah, we'll write you a check, or we'll take it off, some of the money you owe us for trainings and stuff like that. And, but I still never ever got paid. But I got summons to her house and she was really agitated. And so when people are really agitated around me, I'm trained professionally on that because I worked in crisis intervention at a college for 5 years. So I would always try to get her unagitated, because if I couldn't get her unagitated, then I was always in for a big ass chewing, because whatever she was agitated over became my fault at some point. So I was trying to get her unagitated, and she was sitting in a chair and I was sitting across from her. It was in her EM room, and she was just kind of like had her head down like this, and she was just like, and I said, look, just like, what's going on, you can talk to me and blah blah blah. And that's when she said, we're bringing cash across the border from Mexico. And I said, what? And she said, well, most of the Mexicans pay in cash. And I said, well, why doesn't Edgar just put it in his bank account? Now, Edgar Boone was the head of Mexico. He was the top tier. And Mexico was NXIVM's cash cow. I mean, they made the most money out of any organization in NXIVM. And so I knew it was a lot of money. And I said, well, why doesn't Edgar just put it in his account and just wire it up here? And she goes, well, because we're not going to pay taxes on it. And so, inside I'm just going like, oh my God. Well, actually, I said the F word, I'm just like, what? And she said, yeah, we're going to bring it across the border. We're not going to pay cash taxes on it. So I'm thinking like, okay, that's tax evasion and that's money laundering. But I don't want to let her know that I know what they're doing. Right. So inside I'm a mess, but outside I'm just trying to be calm, cool, like, oh, he just told me of 2 major crimes, but I'm not going to let you know that I'm upset about this. Okay, I'll let you know that borrowing money from students is not good and sleeping with students is not good, but I'm not going to let you know that I'm onto this. And I said, oh, yeah, okay. And then she says, but we're bringing it across in 10 million or $10,000 increments because that's legal. And I'm thinking like, oh, now you're trying to justify to me that that's legal. Okay. And I said, oh, well, that's good. So I'm just trying to agree with her at this point, right? You just told me 2 major crimes, but now you're trying to justify. I'm like, oh, okay, that's good. Oh, that's smart. And she said, yeah, when we go to Mexico to train, the trainers are bringing it back in $10 million or $10,000 increments. And then when the students from Mexico come up, the staff and students come up from Mexico, if they're fine with bringing the $10,000 across, they're bringing it over. And I'm like, oh, well, that's a good idea. But inside I'm just freaking out, that she's telling me this. And I'm like, oh, well, that's a good idea. And and then she realizes what she's done, right? She just told a person that they can't get to not pay their taxes, and a person that they can't get to, like, step over the ethical, moral, criminal line for them, what she's said. And then she goes, well, what are you going to do with this information? And I'm like, what? I said, nothing. Look, what can I do with this information? I said, gosh, if I went anywhere and said anything to anybody about it, I said, it would just be my word against yours anyways. Like, what can I do with it? And I'm thinking like, I'm supposed to get on a plane to go back home tomorrow morning. And like, are they going to let me get on that plane? It's like, am I going to end up in a cornfield in Iowa somewhere? It's like, I was scared to death.
Well, it's really wild to think about your first introduction to ESP up to this point here, where you're realizing that you're going to have to make a break from NXIVM somehow, despite this um mounting debt that you are in
Mm-hmm.
from NXIVM themselves shifting the goalposts and introducing these, oh, you just have to jump through this hoop, and then you just have to jump through this hoop, and you just have to, if you want to start earning money back to pay off this debt, you just have to add a little bit more debt and a little bit more debt. And that is really where this starts to feel like Scientology, where you have the OT levels where, oh, to get to this next stage, you just have to understand this, and then you just have to understand this, and OT level 6, 7, 8, 9 that get progressively more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And also what you said about how you went looking for something to fill a gap to supplement what you already were working with, what already existed, was then completely pushed out of your life, and NXIVM became the front and center of everything. That's not giving people skills to take back into their everyday lives. That's making their everyday lives disappear and NXIVM become their world, their everything, their universe.
Right.
Um, which is a really complicated thing to try and unpack, because you had a whole practice. And I wonder if somebody that has a master's in psychology at any point realizes the tactics that are being used against them, or is it so nuanced that even somebody that's qualified to think in a way that most people might not think doesn't recognize them. And
Yeah.
it really does go against the stereotype of the type of person that joins a cult, because you're an educated person working as a counselor at the point you're introduced to ESP. So I've just given us loads to talk about. Sorry,
Yeah.
maybe we should start with how the goalposts were always shifting. I didn't know if there was anything you wanted to say about that and the links to Scientology.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. What I think that I think it's typical in any cult that is organized in such a structure that they constantly are moving, and I think it depends on where you're at in the cult in regards to popularity. Like they said they had a structure for um promotions, and here's this organization that says that they're ethical in regards to like things like promotions and stuff like that, but there were people that were promoted that weren't qualified to be promoted, you know that kind of thing. And so, like, an example of that is Keith had a relationship with Mariana Fernandez, and that's the woman that eventually had his baby, that he wanted to have his baby, you know and like she constantly got promotions that she was never qualified to have the promotion, and that would piss people off, that kind of thing. And then there were other people who got promoted that weren't qualified to get their promotions, and they would get promoted and they'd be like, I'm not really qualified to get a promotion. And then you take somebody like me, that I was qualified to get my promotion from proctor to senior proctor for a long time. And uh, like, I built the Vancouver, BC area, and that would have been my satellite center, which I would have got 10% of that satellite center. Um, and we were waiting for me to get to green so that we could open up Vancouver. But yet they would never promote me to senior proctor. And probably because, one, I was defiant, and two, they didn't want me to satellite that center because I was too defiant. And the other thing is that at that point, they were looking for what I call the beautiful people to be the leaders of NXIVM. The rich, the famous, the more artistic kind of people. They wanted the actors, the Richard Bransons of the world, that kind of thing. They didn't want somebody who was like a working class, uh, lesbian type of person to be a center owner, those kinds of things.
The Tom Cruise of people.
Yeah, the Tom Cruise kind of person to, so, they would much prefer Sarah Edmondson to be the head of the Vancouver Center, which she would have been, but I would have still been the satellite owner of that center, kind of thing. And so, plus I was too defiant, I would say, like, why are you doing this? Kind of thing. They, strategically started to put boulders in my way to prevent certain things to happen. It's almost kind of like they were pushing me out the door, kind of thing. And so, but I think that's typical in cults. It's like, there's certain people that they want to push out, but they don't want us to just say, hey, we're kicking you out, kind of thing. They'll just put boulders in the way, kind of thing.
So there's a dangling carrot of you becoming senior proctor and having a chance to earn 10% of a satellite center, which would go towards paying back the debt that you are in at this point through the financial coercion of Nancy and Keith Raniere. Again, it's such a difficult thing to, like, you're in debt because you're trying to reach this senior status that you can't get to because the group's not letting you, and they're the ones that are charging you for these courses that are putting you in more debt so that you can get out of debt by becoming senior proctor at a satellite center. So it's a really convoluted thing to understand, isn't it? And I recall someone saying to me that in Scientology, if you look at Dianetics in its core principles, it's kind of like pretty general advice, guidance, and life rules that can be quite helpful. But when you add all this extra stuff on top of it, that's, like the promise of enlightenment or whatever it is at the end of the rainbow, or the bridge to total freedom, whichever expression you
Right,
want to
right,
use.
right.
It's no longer just basic principles. It's destructive and toxic in nature. So you start off in ESP thinking, wow, this is really good stuff, this could really help my practice. But as with people that live by Dianetics, it becomes a dependency thing. They can't live life without these teachings, and so it feels very similar in that way as well. What started off as something that could be applied to your current life and seemed quite simple and helpful, then became something that you were entirely dependent on because of the community that you'd been a part of for 9 years, because of the money that you'd put into it. And it then it becomes a whole thing that's not just reading a book and saying, wow, that's really helpful, I could just apply that to my everyday life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that, yeah. And they did the same thing with me as becoming a head trainer. They did the same thing with me in regards to becoming like a EMP practitioner, different streams of income that I worked towards coming, like I became a head trainer, then they took it away from me, those kinds of things. Is that, and I think that that's really true, is that, a, a lot of people that I knew came and they came to my center, they took a 16-day, and maybe they joined in a program that's called Ethos, and where you can come and take classes when you want, and then you get weekly coaching, stuff like that. And they say, hey, I'm really glad I took that, and I'm sorry what happened to you, kind of thing. And they talk about, yeah, I still use those tools that I learned, but they never got involved in the cult of NXIVM. They came and they got the tools, then they left. And when you hear like Nancy in the Vow 2, where she talks about, all these people came through and they got, they got good results. Those are the people that probably got the good results. The people that came and they took the program and they left without getting involved in the cult of NXIVM. The people that got involved in the cult of NXIVM are the ones that got, financially, they got damaged and they got abused because they got involved in the cult. And because when they didn't jump to Nancy and Keith barking at them and doing what Nancy and Keith wanted them to do, then they got abused. Like when I asked questions, then I would get abused around that. I didn't do what they wanted me to do. Like they would want me to come back to level 2 trainings, and I'd say, I can't afford that. I'm not going to go into any more debt. Then I would get abused. When I finally started putting my foot down.
How would that abuse manifest itself in your kind of peer circle within NXIVM?
Oh, well, then people would come, to give me feedback. They would start saying things to me that weren't true about me, those kinds of things. Like Nancy would EM me, and then she was trying to implant things in me that weren't true about me, those kinds of things. Or like, I would get summons to her house when I was back there, and it would be like this big screaming match, a lot of verbal abuse, that kind of thing. And then she would send sentinels out after me, that kind of thing. So different members of the inner circle would come at me, or I'd get phone calls, from different people, saying different things about me. And then she started to infiltrate and poison my well out here, of people that were my friends. A lot of my friends started to like, stop being my friends and stuff like that, because all of a sudden I had anger issues, or I was somehow I had changed, and I'm like, I'm still me, and I've had people that when I shut down my center, they called to give me feedback about that. And then now that when when NXIVM burnt to the ground, those people have called me and come back and said, gosh, I'm really sorry for how I treated you when you left, kind of thing. And I'm like, well, okay, and stuff. And some of those people I've been able to regain friendships with, kind of thing, because they stayed with NXIVM after I closed my center, and so some of those people we've been able to re-garnish our friendship because they realized what I was doing and how they reacted to the inner circle getting to them, kind of thing, and stuff like that.
So feedback is a NXIVM term that
Mm-hmm.
is positioned to be something that you receive as a benefit to you. Like, I'm going to give you feedback here. It's a
Right.
gift. It's
Yeah.
going to help you grow
Yeah.
on your journey in NXIVM, when actually it's kind of more like shaming, public shaming, humiliating.
Yeah.
So you've used a few other words as well. V week. Don't tell me that stands for Vanguard Week.
Yes. Yeah, it was a celebration for his birthday, and it was usually 10 days long. And at first it was actually pretty fun because it was in the northern New York, up in the mountains, kind of thing. It was this big YMCA camp. And at first it was fun, you go there and it was like kind of like a vacation, and you got a vacation kind of thing. And they had all kinds of activities. It was on this big lake, kind of thing. So you could kayak, or sailboat and stuff like that, or rent a boat and go water skiing and stuff like that, and do archery and all kinds of things. And they put on plays, like I think we put on Sweeney Todd, and they would bring in entertainment and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden it changed. And then they started having these work groups. And I'd be like, oh my God, I don't want to do this. I work all year long, and then you put on this thing that we have to go to because, it's a company getaway and we have to celebrate Keith's birthday. And now you want us to do these work groups, like writing work groups, and you want us to go to modules. And like I teach these modules all year long. I don't want to go to a stupid module. So I started skipping that kind of stuff,
Would you have
and
to pay for V Week, even though it's
oh,
just to
yeah.
participate in classes that you teach? You
Well,
have to pay.
it was more paying for your lodging,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Okay.
So, and then lodgings and meals and stuff. But, so kind of thing. But I would start to skip I would start skipping the modules, and I'd start skipping like you had to sign up for some kind of like writer's workshop or something like that. I mean, I'd skip those, and then Nancy would catch me and she'd be like, why aren't you at the workshop? And I'd be like, because, it's like, I don't want to do any of those. And then I'd get feedback about like not participating and stuff. But I'd usually sign up for the play because the plays were usually a musical and stuff. So I'd sign up for the play to be a part of the play because those were fun for me to do. And then you could get out of the other stuff that you didn't want to do, kind of
Well,
thing.
that's creating that community aspect of life within NXIVM that is an extra added layer of why it's so difficult or almost impossible to just walk away from
Right.
everything. We've already talked about the debt and the promise of being able to get out of that debt once you reach a certain level within the group. And then you are being manipulated. You're having these minions deployed to give you feedback. You're subjected to the elements of coercive control in terms of keeping you away from your family and loved ones,
Oh, they did.
jeopardizing
Yeah, they weren't successful at that because
or
I was so far
attempting to
away. Yeah.
jeopardize your
Yeah.
relationships with people by telling them things about you that aren't true.
Yeah. My
Uh,
friends. Yeah.
attempting to coerce you into sexual acts, I
Yes. Oh my
assume on
God.
Nancy's part that you're not interested in. And then on top of that, you've got this beautiful community where you get to do plays and go kayaking, and um that's the really difficult thing, because then you've got these positive experiences that you don't want to miss out on. If you walk away, then you're no longer going to have access to this really wonderful community of
No.
amazing people that is just being uh unfortunately
Yeah.
infiltrated by narcissists that are out for personal gain. um so I
Yeah.
can see what people mean when they say Nexium started out as one thing and turned into something completely different.
Yeah. They did separate me from some of my friends out here. They were unsuccessful at separating me from my family. And the saving grace in a lot of ways for me is I was so far away from Albany, you know, and they didn't try to recruit me to go to Albany, but they did try to recruit my partner. And they were unsuccessful about doing that. And I would ask Nancy periodically, I would be like, why are you trying to get my partner? Which, I try to keep my partner out of these things because there's been a request to do that. So I'm just going to talk about my partner.
Mm-hmm.
But and she said, well, some people need to be in Albany, but not everybody. And I'd be like, well, that's not going to happen. We're a team, and that's not going to happen. But they would, and they did try several times to break us up, which I think is a cult tactic, that kind of thing. But they were unsuccessful at doing that. But they did try to, like, anytime I would go to visit my dad, who lived in another state, they would always call me, and say, you know, um, I would get a call from like Nancy's assistant and say, you really need to take a look at your breach of, like why you're vacationing, And I'd be like, well, fuck you guys. Yeah, that would be my response.
A breach is another term for doing something that the leadership don't agree with.
Right. Yeah. You need to take a look at your breach. It's so funny because I'd be like, well, fuck you guys, you know? Yeah, I'm gonna visit my family. You know, you're not gonna separate me from my I said, that sounds like a cult. Yeah, that's what would be my response. You guys sound like a cult now that you're trying to separate me from my family. Well, that's not what we're doing, but you have things that you should be doing besides taking time to visit your family. And I'd say, well, my center is successfully working. I have more etho students than you guys do. So when you get the number of etho students that I do, then you can tell me what to do. And I would just throw it back in their face.
The the operation in Albany, that was the HQ of NXIVM.
Mm-hmm.
So Albany is really where the the secret inner circle of NXIVM, the DOS aspect of NXIVM was really carried out in Albany.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a whole there's a whole story around DOS, around the horrific things that happened, that I think people can really understand the depravity of Keith Raniere by watching The Vow Season 1, The Vow Season 2, Seduced, and really getting an understanding of the picture from the aerial view right down into DOS, who was involved in DOS, what things happened in DOS. But for the sake of this interview, we're really just going to stick to your story, Susan. And I wondered if your psychology training ever kicked in at any point, and had you kind of putting things together, and if that played a part in you deciding to walk away.
Well, I think my red flags, that's where I became observant of certain things going on. Like, when in 2003, there was a student that was in a training up in Alaska. It was her second training. And she started to deteriorate in the training. And there's still a lot of stuff we'll never know about that. Um, and and instead of calling in the mental health therapist, or which I would have done based on my training at the college, or getting her psychological help, they just kicked her out of the training and took her home. And then um there was supposedly a suicide note from her. There's a documentary called Lost Women in NXIVM that I was involved in, and we don't know. There's a bunch of different theories out there of what happened to her. When I heard about her death, I was told by Nancy Salzman that she had committed suicide, which I was shocked about because I was at her first 5 day of her first intensive. Um, and then I saw her when we were both in Albany, New York. I was shocked that she committed suicide. NXIVM's reaction when a student started to deteriorate in trainings was to just say that they were trying to seek attention, kind of thing, where that's not always the case. Sometimes when people go through any kind of trainings like that, they're stuff comes up for them for whatever reason. And you don't just send a person home like that. Or another thing that they did was they would take them to a upper member's house, and then they would get a prescription drug, and then minister that prescription drug, like an anti-anxiety drug or something, and administer that to the student and kind of let them calm down, where you should bring in a mental health professional. But they didn't want to do that because they thought it would reflect badly on their training. That was a red flag for me. Like, none of you guys are trained on how to deal with somebody that's starting to deteriorate in a training. And so, and I would always talk to them, like, none of you guys are really qualified on how to deal with this. And I think part of it is that they sometimes would push people in the wrong direction. This is a self-help kind of program. It's like, you don't push people psychologically. That's not what this program is designed to do. None of you guys are therapists. I wouldn't do it in a training because that's not what the course of the training is designed to do. And so, but again, I think it's because of that slow drip that happens in a training like that. It's like you can't see everything that there is designed to do. And a lot of times when people watch a documentary like The Vow and stuff like that, be like, well, how can you not see this? Well, it's like you're looking at the outside in, you're seeing all the bad shit. Nobody would join NXIVM if they just watched The Vow and said, hey, do you want to sign up? Everybody'd be like, of course I don't want to sign up, kind of thing. But you don't see it from the time when you walk into a beginning seminar, kind of thing.
Each season is sort of like 6 hours or so. We're talking about 9 years of your life.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
important to put those things into perspective as well.
Right.
And you've joined at a time where ESP is picking up traction, and you've mentioned that by the time you're hearing about illegal activity, there's centers all over the place. There's centers in Alaska, there's centers in Mexico. So you've really been a part of NXIVM as it's expanded and grown and become almost like a household name. You've mentioned the Bronfman sisters, who are the daughters of.
He was the owner of Seagram's 7, but they had sold it by then. And then he was the head of the World Jewish congregation, I mean, they were big, big business people. And so, I mean, he was internationally well respected. And so, you know, in the Brockman family is, I mean, they're just internationally well known and stuff. And so, you know, and so, after I heard about the illegal activity, I knew I had to leave because otherwise then I'm just complicit to that illegal activity kind of thing. And so I started setting my plans in motion to leave at that time, because I wasn't going to be a part of a criminal activity. I mean, that was the red flag that went up on my shelf that collapsed it kind of thing. It's like, I'm out of here. And at that time, Jeunesse was just a weekend workshop, and it was, when I took the weekend workshop, I went to Nancy and I said, what is this caveman stuff? You're talking about men hitting women in the head and dragging them back in the cave. Men can be non-monogamous. They, the whole training was that men did not have the ability to be monogamous kind of thing. And I'm like, what are you trying to, and it was all a setup for that, it was a justification why Keith could not be with one woman, really is what the whole setup was for that.
So at this point, you've seen NXIVM expand. You've seen the injection of the cash flow from the Bronfman sisters really allow the enterprise to grow into its own. And at this point, there are multiple different workshops that exist with multiple different levels. And then what does Jeunesse stand for?
Well, it was a women's group at that time, It doesn't really stand for anything. It was just a women's movement. It was supposed to be for women only. And at that time, they had a weekend workshop and then they had women's groups, and it could be over anything like, and, some women got together and they had reading groups and some women had knitting groups and some women, and I just couldn't see me being involved in it in any way. And I just told Nancy, I don't want any part of this. I said, I think it's very misogynistic and you're trying to teach women that it's okay for men to be non-monogamous. And I said, I don't agree with that. And I just don't want any part of it. And, I'm personally not going to be involved in it, but, great. I said, I'm going to just stick to the 16-day training, and I don't want any part of it.
And the point in which Nancy tells you about the money laundering and the tax evasion, she's already been trying to be involved with you sexually or romantically.
Well, that happened early on. That was in my first year,
Oh,
you know.
okay.
Yeah, that happened in my first year, and then that didn't really go anywhere. I think she realized that, I wasn't going to fall for that trick, you know.
So when you said that, when you mentioned that you were planning on your departure from NXIVM, what was your thought process like, and what measures did you put in place so that you could do that?
Well, I came home after that happened, and I didn't tell anybody about it. I mean, I didn't even tell my partner about it because I didn't want to involve anybody in that knowledge. But I called my coach. Well, I told Kim that I had to close the center. I said, I'm done. I said, I have to leave. But I had things in Albany that I had to close up because I was in a partnership in a house back there, and I had I had a car back there, and I had household, I had stuff back there, because I flew in sometimes twice a month back there. So I had to things I had to close down back there. But so I called my coach, and I said, I'm gonna leave NXIVM. I said, I'm done. And my coach at the time was Barbara Boucher, and there was a lot of stuff going around about her, like Keith wasn't talking to her, and she was kind of on the outs with NXIVM herself. And I said, I'm going to leave NXIVM, and I said, I'm going to shut down my training facility. And I said, I know it's going to create a lot of havoc. And I said, but I need for you to keep this quiet. I said, I don't want you to go to any of the leadership and tell them that. I said, I'm going to try to leave quietly. And she said, okay. She said, are you going to come back at that time, the Dalai Lama had planned to have come back for a month or a week, and he was going to work with NXIVM for a week, but he had canceled that. He had heard some bad things about NXIVM at the time, and he canceled that. So NXIVM had planned this week-long event to just do workshops and stuff like that. And she said, are you still going to come back for the non-Dalai Lama event, is what people were going to call it? And I said, well, I bought tickets to come back for that. And that's when I was going to come back and shut everything down. And I said, but I'm not going to go to the NXIVM event. So she said, well, why don't you just come back and let's talk? And I said, don't try to talk me into staying. I said, I can't tell you why I'm leaving. I'm just leaving. And she said, well, I have some concerns too. And so she said, why don't you just come back and we'll talk? She said, I have a group of women back here that can have some concerns too. And she said, is your partner coming back too? And I said, yeah, we're going to both come back and close up our stuff. And so we did. She said, why don't you just stay with me? So that's when a group of us got together and we shared all of our concerns. And so,
Wow.
yeah,
What was that
it's,
like?
it was actually, everything they told me is stuff I had expected with Keith and his sex life. And I suspected Barbara had a sexual relationship with Keith, which she told me she did. And the reason that Keith wasn't talking to her is because Barbara broke up with him. And that's why he wasn't talking to her. And then
Did that mean that others weren't talking to her by extension because
yep,
of his right?
yeah. And then another woman told me that she had been approached to have a sexual relationship with Keith, but she wasn't interested in that. And she said Pam Kayfreds did the same conversation with her that she did with me about Nancy. And I went, oh my God, that was the same setup that Pam did with me with Nancy. And they said, what? And I said, that's the same. Like, Keith is lonely. He's the vanguard. He needs friends, And then Keith did the walk with Pam, or with this woman, and said, if we're to have a sexual relationship, you can't share it with anybody because I'm the vanguard. And I said, oh my God, that's the same thing Nancy said to me.
So when Nancy Solzman says in The Vow season 2 that she kind of had an idea that Keith Raniere was sleeping with people, but also didn't really know. She absolutely knew because she was using the same script that he was using.
Nancy knew every single woman because Nancy EM'd all of them, which in Scientology is what do they call it in Scientology when they work with people? Well, it's like a counseling session. That's what an exploration of meaning is.
Because it's got its own like acronym as well, hasn't it, in Scientology, which is why everybody always compares them to
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing. So it's
an
auditing,
e-meter. Yeah, auditing,
an
that's it.
auditing. Yeah. So like, yeah, when they so an EM is just like an auditing session in Scientology. So yeah, Nancy would EM all the women because when Keith started sleeping with women, they believed he was monogamous with them only. And then when they eventually found out that he was sleeping with a group of women, then they, of course, would have a reaction. Who wouldn't, right? And so, and then Nancy was usually called in to EM them. Nancy, Lauren, Karen were called in to work with them. Like, well, why do you need to own him? Isn't it just like playing tennis with somebody else? Those kinds of things. And so, yeah, when this woman told me about her experience, I said, "Oh my God, that was the same setup Pam did with me with Nancy." And then Nancy made her advances, and I don't think Nancy's a lesbian, and I personally don't think she was really attracted to me. I think it was probably either an assignment from Keith to get collateral on me, or to get my partner to break up with me over it, or that kind of thing. But no, I just don't cheat. I'm not a cheater, kind of thing.
So so women are explicitly told to accept that Keith will be with multiple women, but these women are never allowed to be with anybody else. Otherwise,
Correct.
they or even on their own. It's either Keith or nothing and nobody, or total shunning from Keith Raniere and everybody that he's involved with.
Right. Well, it's like the woman who was locked in the room for 2 years, that they talk about in trial, Danny. She was locked in that room because she kissed another man. That was the main reason she was put in that room. But her parents were told that she stole money. And she did take the money, but she put all of it back. She felt guilty about it, and so she put it back, and then she told Keith about it. Well, Keith made that what was a horrible thing, that she even took the money, even though she was being paid slave labor, that kind of thing. And Keith went back on his promise that he was supposed to, work with her, and she turned down a full ride scholarship, all this kind of stuff. And so there was no understanding on his part, in regards to all the promises he broke to her and stuff like that. But he told her parents that she was like this horrible person, and if she didn't come around, that she was going to be, like a psychopath kind of thing. And so, she kissed this guy that she was attracted to, and so he locks her in this room for 2 years, takes away all of her papers, her birth certificate, her passport, her visa, and stuff like that. And people were like, well, why didn't she just walk out? She wasn't locked in the room. Well, like, where was she supposed to go? She had no way to get back to Mexico. It's
And
like,
her
it's
entire family are involved with Keith Raniere at this point and have been subjected to his most strenuous manipulations.
right. Yeah. Her parents are brainwashed to keep her in the room, and, they're dropping off food at her door. And, it's just like, oh my God. It's like, well, yeah, she could have walked out, but where's she supposed to go? Yeah.
Included in the kind of keeping women prisoner is the branding, which is well documented. Some women was inside DOS, which is a sort of like an inner circle of NXIVM that was super secret, and women were, it's like a master and slave situation with Keith
Mm-hmm.
Raniere as the master, and he would instruct women to do awful things, but then sometimes instruct women to instruct some of the other women to do awful things as well, making them complicit in his depravity, which included branding women, collecting collateral on women, uh, locking women in rooms, enforcing
Right.
terminations of pregnancy. So when we talk about like the really horrific stuff that happened in NXIVM, this is kind of what's referenced. But it's so important to discuss your story as well, Susan, and how DOS was able to happen from you kind of like, from joining in 2000 up to this point where you're sitting in this room with all of these women who are talking about their experiences uh inside NXIVM with Nancy Salzman and Keith Raniere, and you're all saying the same thing. I don't know that that happens very often in groups, because it's the consequences of leadership finding out that you've all had this conversation. It could mean for some women being locked in a room for 2 years, of
Right.
having
Well,
everything taken away from them.
well, we met, and then it was, I had already decided I was going to leave. And well, we met, and then Barbara decided to bring some people in and tell them what, all that we had discovered and stuff. And I did disclose to those women that what Nancy had told me about the money laundering and the tax evasion. And so we brought some people in and explained to them what was going on. And it was amazing the number of people that stayed after we disclosed to them what was going on. And then Barbara decided to see if Keith would meet with us after that. And so he agreed. He met with us for 3 days, and he allowed me to video it, which I was really surprised he allowed me to video it. And so on day one, 9 of us met with him. And then we came back to Barbara's house, and then we watched the video. And then on day 2, only 4 of us met with him. And during the whole time, it was just one manipulation after another, one justification after another. And at the end of day 2, I had a complete total meltdown. It was like everything, it was kind of like the floodgates of everything I experienced in NXIVM kind of just opened up. And it was just like, it was just kind of like, it was like all the betrayals that ever happened just kind of flashed before my face. Kind of, you know, they say that when you die, everything in your life flashes before your face. It was like the death of NXIVM happened to me. And everything I experienced flashed before my face. And I sobbed like a little baby. And I knew there was no going back ever for me. And so I didn't go back the third day. But my partner took the camera and filmed the third day. And it was just my partner and Barbara that went back that day. And the thing was just to say, we're done. We're leaving. And so that night, Barbara said, excuse me. She just said, let's write a resignation letter. And so Barbara thought that they would pay us what they owed us. And I fought for a long time about that. I said, they're not going to pay us anything. And she said, oh no, they'll pay us, because she thought that they would pay us. And I said, I don't think they'll pay us. I mean, why would they? We're leaving, and I don't think they will. But she said, well, let's try. And so usually when you have a book of business, they'll pay, like an insurance company. Like if I'm an insurance company and I have a book of business, I have a right to sell that book of business back. And as a center owner and a field trainer, I had a right to sell that book of business back. And so I asked for the value of what my book of business would have been for 5 years. And so I asked for that value. And then I had commissions that were still owed to me. And then Barbara had loaned Keith $2 million to pay off of commodities, almost $2 million. And then other people had commissions. So we added that all up. And we added it into our resignation letter. And then we had said that if they paid that to us, that we would walk away quietly. But if they didn't want to pay us that, then we would go to the press and say that we resigned. Well, they took that as extortion and said that they were going to go to the DA and get us arrested. Well, so then Barbara hired her own attorney, and then I had enough credit left on a credit card that I hired the 7 rest of us an attorney. So we showed the letters to our attorneys, and they all laughed and said, "Oh, this is an extortion. You're just saying that you'll walk away quietly, versus if they don't want to pay, you'll go to the press and talk about your leaving." When 9 women walk away from a cult, that's something to be said, and they all do it at once. And so they went to the DA, but the DA just said the same thing, like, "Well, this is an extortion," kind of thing. But then I sent out a letter to all of the people in my organization out here that were center members, and said that I was closing the center down. And then I called 2 separate people, a couple that were in my center, and then a woman. And I called them and I said to the couple, I said, "Can you go to the center and change all the locks?" And to the other person, I said, "Can you go to the center and remove all the computers?" I said, "I can't tell you what's going on. Just, can you do this for me?" Because I was afraid that they would have somebody that was next and would have one of their people here go in, take the computers, and then take everything and then say I sold it, you know? And so they said, "Okay." And so I said, "You have to go now," you know? And so, so the couple did that, and then the other person came and got the computers. And then I got a text message from this woman saying, "Hey, you've been gone for a little while. I'm going to go down and check on this center." And I didn't know what her intent was. I didn't know if anybody called her and said, "Hey, can you go grab the computers," or whatever. And so I on my phone texting them, and I said, "So and so's on their way down. Can you guys get out of there?" Because I didn't want her pulling in as they were trying to leave or anything. And so they hurried up and got everything out of there. And then I got a text message from the person who was coming to check on the center. She said, "Hey, my keys won't work in the door. Do you know what's going on?" I said, "Oh, gosh, I don't know what's going on, but, I'll be home in a couple of days, and I'll check on everything." But I was so afraid that they would, have somebody come in and take that stuff and then say I stole it, kind of stuff. But all that stuff, the videotapes and the notes and stuff like that didn't belong to me, but the computers were mine, kind of stuff. But it had their documentation stuff on it that belonged to them. And then I tried to get their materials back to them. I have, like, I don't know, 13 pages of emails between myself and their attorneys trying to get their materials back to them. And they just jerked me around. And then when they took me to court, they said I refused to give their materials back to them, and then, I had to show the judge, like, "Well, I haven't refused. I've just been unable to get them back to them, But they sued me, when I left, and then I had to represent myself in court, kind of thing. But yeah, it's been quite the journey since I left.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series on NXIVM. For more information about Susan's work, you can go to susandones.com or follow the links in the episode description. To get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.